Just a couple of days ago, the US Court of Appeals ruled that many of Trump's tariffs were illegal, and yet they're still in place. If a US court rules something illegal, but the policy stays in place anyway, what happens next? That's exactly what's playing out right now in the US, and it's a story that affects not just American businesses, but Canadian exports, global trade flows, and even future tax revenues. In a 7-4 decision, a US federal appeals court has just ruled that most of President Trump's sweeping tariffs were unlawful. They exceeded presidential authority under current law. The catch is that those tariffs are still in effect for now. This video explains what's happening, why it matters, and what it tells us about the legal limits of executive power and the real costs of global tariff strategy. And by the way, if you're Canadian or European, don't scroll away. These tariffs affect you too. Before we get into it, and we'll discuss this a lot later, which US state joined the lawsuit against Trump's tariffs? Texas, Oregon, Florida? Comment your best guess, we'll reveal the answer at the end, and I'll explain why it matters. Let's get into it. Let's go back to January 2025. Donald Trump is sworn in again, and within weeks, the White House issues a series of executive orders placing tariffs on a wide range of imported goods. Aluminum, steel, auto parts, even medical equipment. The countries affected were China, Canada, Germany, Brazil, some rivals, some allies, and the justification was that it was a national emergency. Specifically, the administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, another mouthful. It's a law passed in 1977 to give the president special powers in cases of extraordinary foreign threats. IEEPA is normally used for sanctions, blocking assets of terrorist groups, cutting off trade with hostile nations, things like that. But in 2025, the White House used it to slap broad tariffs on friendly trade partners. They declared an emergency over a variety of things. We'll discuss them later. The list was long and legally kind of shaky. Imagine the president using a law meant for wartime threats and applying it to aluminum imports from Canada. That's essentially what happened. And most immediately, of course, the lawsuits followed. The key questions for the courts wasn't whether tariffs are allowed, it was how they were justified. Here's how this played out legally. I'll explain it super simply. The case was first heard by the U.S. Court of International Trade. That's a specialized federal court that handles disputes about trade, tariffs, and customs. If you're a business or a state government challenging how trade laws are applied, that's usually where your case starts. And in this case, the court ruled against the Trump administration. It said that the tariffs had been imposed without proper legal authority. Then in August 2025, a higher court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, reviewed that decision. Think of this as an appellate court that checks whether the first court got the legal reasoning right. And it upheld the ruling, meaning it agreed that the administration had overstepped. Now here's where the law comes in. As mentioned before, the Trump administration had imposed these tariffs under the law called IEEPA. It's used to freeze assets or apply targeted sanctions, not to retool trade policy, and that was the core issue. The court said that the president can't impose sweeping global tariffs unless Congress has clearly authorized it. And under IEEPA, Congress had already made an important limitation. It excluded measures like tariffs that are already governed by other trade laws, such as the Trade Act or the Tariff Act. In plain terms, IEEPA isn't a trade policy Swiss Army knife. It's a scalpel meant for narrow emergency responses, not for rewriting trade rules on a global scale. The court also looked at the justification itself for the tariffs. The administration had linked the tariffs to things like fentanyl imports, saying that drug trafficking across U.S. borders justified broad economic action. But the quote said that was, quote, a tenuous and overbroad reading of presidential emergency powers. And in U.S. law, that kind of overreach definitely matters, because even if Congress gives the president some discretion on tariffs, there are still limits, and according to the court, this crossed them. So this case isn't just about trade, it's about constitutional boundaries and the separation of powers. Congress makes the laws, the president enforces them. If the White House starts creating sweeping policy without clear legislative backing, U.S. courts often step in, eventually. Here's where it gets actually complicated. The Court of Appeals declared that most of the tariffs were unlawful, but it also made a key decision not to enforce the ruling just yet. Why is this delay happening? Because the U.S. administration has announced plans to appeal to the Supreme Court. This is the highest court in the land. And in cases like this, especially those involving national economic policy, Courts will often hold off on immediate enforcement if there is a real chance that the decision could be reversed later. In a nutshell, there's been enough volatility already, and the courts aren't going to inject any more of it. This pause is part of a legal principle called a stay of judgment. It's meant to prevent whiplash. Imagine reversing a major government policy one day only to have it reinstated a few months later. That kind of policy seesaw can be confusing for markets, costly for businesses, and destabilizing for international relations. For now, the logic is let's not make irreversible changes until we're sure this ruling will stick. In this case, the court gave the White House until October 14th, 2025 to file its appeal. That's the window during which the Supreme Court can choose to take up the case or decline to hear it, which would essentially let the lower court ruling stand. And make no mistake, this case is about more than just tariffs. It's about the boundaries of executive power, the role of Congress, and how emergency economic laws are interpreted and applied. It's kind of a big deal in the legal world. Until the Supreme Court weighs in, the tariff stays in place, even though 2 federal courts have now said that the legal foundation beneath them is shaky. This is the legal equivalent of a check engine light. The car is still running, but everyone's watching to see what happens next. And once that October 14th deadline passes, things could move very quickly. Whether the tariffs are rolled back, revised, or re-legitimized, that moment will shape not just U.S. trade policy, but also how much legal leeway any future president has when navigating global economic emergencies. I'll be watching this ruling very closely and will likely comment on it when it comes out, so if you'd like to stick around for that, please click that subscribe button gently. Now, let's talk dollars and why tariffs, even when they raise money, can quietly sabotage the very goals they're meant to achieve. Because while potentially illegal, these tariffs weren't just a trade measure, they also had fiscal implications. Back in 2017, during President Trump's first term, the administration passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a sweeping law that slashed corporate tax rates from 35% to 21% and reduced income taxes for many high earners. In doing so, the U.S. government gave up a significant stream of revenue, of course. While the official justification for tariffs in 2025 focused on national emergencies, some analysts also argue that they also served as a secondary function to raise revenue to help offset those earlier tax cuts. In other words, if less money was coming in through traditional taxes, tariffs became an indirect way to fill a part of that gap. And they did. The federal government collected hundreds of billions of dollars from tariffs, enough to make them a serious fiscal tool, not just trade policy levers. But here is where the trade-off comes in. Tariffs don't just generate money, they also distort the system itself. When you make imported goods more expensive, that cost trickles down to consumers and businesses. A manufacturer might now be paying more for steel or packaging. A shopkeeper might see their electronics or supplies go up in price. And for regular people like us, that can mean higher costs for anything from canned food to building materials. It's basically a tax built into the things you need. The other issue is what economists call deadweight loss, the inefficiency that comes when you protect domestic producers too aggressively. If foreign competition is shut out, there is less pressure to innovate, cut prices, or improve quality. You can end up with lower performance at higher prices, and nobody really wins. And then there is the risk of retaliation. Other countries don't just accept tariffs quietly. Canada, the EU, Japan, they all signal their intent to respond in kind, and those countermeasures hit US exporters, farmers, car makers, tech suppliers. So in protecting one part of the economy, you might be undercutting another. More videos and pivots from other countries are linked above, and the part that's rarely mentioned is that the US trade deficit didn't shrink after these tariffs were introduced, it actually got worse. Which kind of makes sense when you look at the mechanics of it. American exports fell because of retaliation and uncertainty, but US consumers, they kept importing just at higher prices, so the gap actually widened. So even if the intention was to correct trade imbalances or support domestic jobs, the result, at least in the short term, is a more expensive supply chain and a bigger deficit. I discussed this whole widening of the deficit in this video linked above, so if you're looking for the next video to watch, this one is a strong candidate. Tariffs can sound strong, patriotic even, but when they're used without coordination or framed as catch-all tools, they often behave like a tax with hidden side effects. And those effects ripple through real lives, quietly, steadily, and often invisibly. If you appreciate this kind of calm economic first analysis, there's a Ko-fi link below. There's nothing but L brain power here. I'm just trying to explain the world clearly, and every contribution helps. And so many parties are affected by this. Auto manufacturers say input costs are rising. Hospitals are paying more for imported medical equipment. School districts report tighter construction budgets due to pricier steel. It isn't only corporate grumbling. We're talking real pressure on public services and infrastructure. In fact, the state of Oregon joined a lawsuit arguing that the tariffs were harming taxpayers and exceeding legal limits on presidential authority. That's the answer from the question at the start. It's Oregon. And while that's unfolding domestically, U.S. allies are watching too. Many of them signed trade deals in good faith under the previous administration, and now they're asking if one executive order can override an entire agreement, what's the point of signing anything? That kind of uncertainty becomes a cost of its own. Because as one trade negotiator put it, tariffs are taxes, yes, but unpredictability is far worse. Businesses can't plan around that. So where does this go next? The Supreme Court could take up the case or not. If it declines, the lower court's decision stands and the tariffs must be lifted. But that's not as simple as it sounds. Removing them means giving up significant source of federal revenue. That opens up new questions. Raise taxes, cut spending, run higher deficit. If the Supreme Court does take the case and sides with the White House, it would dramatically expand presidential power over trade. Emergency declarations, even loosely justified, could become the new norm. Either way, this is about more than just tariffs. It's about how power is distributed in U.S. governance and whether global trade rules can survive the age of executive improvisation. How much legal clarity and economic predictability are we willing to trade for flexibility and control? Tariffs aren't just taxes, they're tools of leverage, symbols of sovereignty, and increasingly legal tests. Because when a president imposes trade barriers under the label of emergency, it tells the world something not just about what's happening today, but about how stable and lawful the system really is. This court decision won't just affect import prices, it could reshape how the U.S. negotiates, enforces, and maintains its trade commitments for decades to come. And yet tariffs remain. Two courts say they're illegal, businesses say they're harmful, allies say they're reckless, but the machinery grinds on, one appeal at a time. If you found this useful, I think you'll like this other video on why U.S. tariffs are backfiring and making the trade deficit worse. It unpacks how these policies often do the opposite of what they promise and what a smarter trade design could look like. Because in the end, trade is trust, and trust is hard to restore once broken. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.